Thank you, Patrick. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 28th regular meeting of the Walpole Select Board. It's now after 7 o'clock, our posted meeting time. I call the meeting to order. Let's stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So our first order of business is we have the Peregrine Group in to speak to us about the work they've been doing with the Old Town Hall and the effort that we are underway to figure out what to do with the Old Town Hall. We spent some or applied some ARPA money to do this work, and are interested in hearing what the Peregrine Group has to say, and hopefully help us think through what we'll be doing with the town hall. So I think it's Eric Bush from the Peregrine Group. Eric, if you could come on up to the mic, that'd be awesome. And I know you gave us a presentation, so let's just go ahead and go through it.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And let me just cue up this presentation here. Yep, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak with everyone tonight. Really appreciate it. And wanted to kind of introduce myself and the process, give a little context, and then lead to kind of where that analysis is at current. So first off, I'm Eric Bush, the managing partner for a company called the Peregrine Group that you all engaged several months ago. We are a real estate advisory firm, so this is kind of right down the main criteria of what we do. We've been a 20-year-old firm located just over the border in East Providence or Rumford, Rhode Island. A lot of experience in me personally with historic buildings, adaptive reuse, a lot of kind of Main Street level development projects over the course of several years. And really looking at it from a perspective of all different housing or different types of building and reuse, from residential, commercial, retail, et cetera. So tried to take that perspective and bring it forward. And a couple slides here on context, if you'll bear with me, because I know many of you have been involved in this process much longer than I, but thought it was important to kind of set the table for the discussion. As you know, the Old Town Hall has been studied over many years, fairly extensively, and we kind of listed out here some of the more recent activities. Most recently with Compass Project Management, really looking at sort of a cost side look at the building based on plans, based on code analysis, et cetera, and really looking at how to update and revisit some of the cost perspective. You did all go out for a lease, RFP for a lease in December of 2020. Some other items that took place here, RFP in 2019 as well. And I'm sure those were impacted by COVID at the time. And then, going back in time, really some very in-depth, and I should say, not to be the authority on everything, but from a new perspective, new set of eyes, some really incredible work that was done in previous iterations, really detailed, really thoughtful look at ways the building could be reused, both from an architectural standpoint, as well as getting into some of the numbers, costs, et cetera. And then also, just for context, as many of you know, you went for a one-stop grant application for an underutilized properties funding in 2021. That was not awarded, unfortunately. And then I think there's many more, and as we got into a process of trying to understand the potential reuse of the building, heard from a lot of folks and talked with a lot of folks that had really spent some time, private side folks that had looked at the building and tried to make their program or plan fit and work within the structure. So for further context, when we were brought in, we had some kind of key questions that were put in front of us, and all the rich history, a really incredible aesthetic. Why is it still sitting there? It's been out to market a couple times. And the phrase, if it was simple, it would already be redeveloped. What are those hurdles that are keeping it from moving forward? And then really what we'll dive into in the next couple of minutes, what we were asked to do is not so much to revisit past work in terms of trying to poke holes, not to look at things and say I don't know why they would have placed the staircase here. It was more about picking it up and looking at it, turning it around a little bit as that potential RFP respondent, as a developer, as someone who would be looking at an RFP like this for development, and being able to look at it and provide our perspective to it and try to identify what those hurdles might be or what those roadblocks might be, and then ideally how to kind of push through that. We were also kind of part of our scope, or part of our discussion up front, was not so much to just create another report, for the shelf, but to really try and inform a process going forward, and some thoughts around how to potentially move it forward. And then, again, to bring that perspective, to bring that private financing perspective as well as the development side. Some stated goals, and this was as part of reaching out to us, but we saw also carried through previous work. There's been a lot of thought and good work done, and there's clearly a desire to preserve and protect the building. We never came across or even thought about demolition of the building and starting fresh. This is more about, within these goals of preserving, protecting that building, how to look at it. Understanding that the town has been carrying the cost burden, from an operating perspective for several years, and looking at some of the budgets in the current budget, about $30,000 in expenses is carried for 2024 fiscal, and there's been a couple $100,000 spent since 2014. And then we also understood that, and once we started looking at the market in Walpole more, it's certainly in the center of a lot of other activity. There's a lot of great stuff going on, a lot of demand, and that certainly wasn't the issue. But this is sitting there. Can it help to stabilize? Can it help to catalyze other things that are happening? And then we also understood that there's a desire to allow public access. Rich history. How do you allow people in the town to be able to access that first floor in particular? I know I'm going heavy on context, but I'm now moving on to sort of the process. So what we were asked to do, and it's kind of a collaborative process with your team, is to say, okay, let's start off by, instead of trying to recreate the wheel here, let's look at all this great work that's been done. Let's really dig in for a couple of weeks and understand it, read through it. Let's get on site with the team and look at it, talk through some of the thoughts that have come up before, and then we basically, based on those discussions and some of the other work, we started to talk with folks in the market who had spent significant time. As many of you know, people had come in and designed, spent some design dollars in looking at how can we make this work for a restaurant, a brewery, a commercial space, and different groups had spent a little time and energy on it, and we wanted to understand, okay, what happened? Why didn't you move forward? Why weren't you interested? What hurdles did you run into, and what shaped your thinking? And so as we were going through that and really understanding the market, we started to take, as I said, we have this sort of development perspective, but we started to shift a little bit more into this is really seems to be a fit for more of an operating partner, that any developer that would come in would really need someone who's going to be using that space. So creating a kind of speculative shell for an office building, something like that, didn't seem to fit the bill, doesn't seem to work from a market perspective. So we wanted to understand from those potential operators what's kind of keeping you from being able to reuse this building. And those reuse plans in the past, and I think in current market, from what we looked at, kind of that highest and best use, really fell into these categories of there's a lot of demand out there for arts and cultural space. In the community, a lot of folks, and I think a lot of potential kind of alignment with what the building is and where it is. We also saw that there's a lot of success and a lot of unmet demand and met demand for business use, for shared office models. There's a couple of key players and operators within the market that are doing quite well and have looked at this, would love space in that location. So talking with them and looking at their way of looking at it a little bit. And then also a very common use for buildings like this, because it is often the most economically advantageous, is to look at, can you do some sort of apartments above a more commercial, a more publicly welcoming first floor, but start to convert upper floors into apartments. And we want to just take a look at that from sort of a financial feasibility and development perspective. So as we were going through this, some of these key factors that jumped out. And again, I apologize for many of you, you've heard this people have probably been involved with this, this previous work that's been done, culled out a couple of items from, in particular, the Compass study that was completed, I believe, in May of last year, and it was drawing on the studies of 2019. But essentially, as you read through this and read through previous reports, there's this kind of big hurdle, a big first step in the reuse of this building. As soon as you go beyond just kind of the small work that would allow it to kind of stay as it is, or as the police used it in previous years, as you start to advance beyond that and start to change use, improve more than 50% of the area, you really start to trigger all of these kind of code issues, structural issues. You're taking a building that was, built quite a long time ago for a different use, and now to bring it to modern codes, this is where you start to run into that hurdle of this big first step of, yes, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in a relatively small building to make it usable for, say, a restaurant, apartments, office space, et cetera. And what that translates into, and again, I won't read from the slide here, but I know it was shared in advance, and this is from your previous report. These kind of uses, when put really on a conceptual but pretty thoughtful manner, as was done before, in 2019, the thought was it would be about $523 per square foot to kind of bring it up to a new standard. So once you're going to really touch the building, you're bringing it up to a standard for modern codes, modern compliance, modern structural codes. It's about over $500 a foot, and you're really just back to a shell, a better than shell, but a not fully fit out building. In mid-22, when Compass really dug into the building, they actually increased those numbers. And we had a call with them to kind of walk through their conclusions. But that $523 a foot, or $5.5 million, in today's dollars, or really in $22, was about $7 million. Because of cost increases, because of different factors, that first step has become a little bit greater and a little bit daunting. So that was one of the key, or really the overriding key factor. So what we did, again, I want to keep pulling that lens back a little bit. What we did in bringing in this perspective of someone who might be interested in redeveloping the building was to say, okay, let's do our kind of back of the envelope financial analysis that says, is this feasible or not, if we're looking at it. And so what we did is we started to build a budget and a financial model for each of those kind of general buckets that I talked about, and said, let's take the past work and let's use those costs as they were laid out in 22, and let's look at now layering in some market assumptions about what rent would look like, what operating expenses would look like, kind of the key ingredients that would go into looking at redeveloping a building, what its value would be worth after it's redeveloped. Compare that to the cost and that general feasibility check of saying, if we're going to spend X amount of dollars, will the building, when we're done, be worth close to X amount of dollars, or is it less than or more than, that general feasibility test? So in doing so, a couple of notes before I get into some tables here. We assume that the building acquisition cost, and I do understand from previous conversations that this has been a topic that's been visited a few times, but we did assume that the land or building had an acquisition value of 0, just for simplicity in the model, just as a starting place to say, if someone were to give this building, if the town were to give this building to someone to redevelop it, let's just assume it's 0 for simplicity to understand what the feasibility looks like. And then again, when we layered in these rents and operating expenses and these key factors, went out, did a survey on the market, spoke with the folks that I had already mentioned, and I'm kind of purposely not naming names because I don't want to call out what folks said 6 months ago, but happy to share further information. And then also some of the kind of standard market reports like CoStar, we leverage those to understand these are market reports that will show you data within a market, and we could pull from that. And then what we did is really start to just generally say we've got costs, we've got operating expenses and rent. If we were going to finance this, what would it look like from a debt and equity perspective? I know it's getting smaller and smaller as I go through, so I apologize for that. This is, and again, I won't walk you through and bore you to death on this snowy night here, but applying the square footage, what the rents would look like, what operating expenses would look like, really getting down to a point. In this scenario, this is a residential above commercial. This is apartments on the upper floors, and fitting that out. And if we assume, and this is very back of the envelope, any real analysis of this would need to dive further into design, but laid out, if we could fit 9 apartments in there, which seemed somewhat reasonable, using those first floor and the lower level as kind of commercial space, here's what the market rents would look like. And you could produce a revenue of here about $300,000 per year in looking at that building. This is part of our throwing the ingredients together to look at feasibility. And then the flip side of that, if we're producing that much revenue, wanted to understand the budget again, land and assuming the acquisition value is 0. And really here, happy to walk through any questions, but this is pulling from those past reports where there is a great deal of detail. Not adding a lot of escalation to it, not really playing with it much, adding a couple dollars here and there for, let's say, in this model where you have apartments, there's going to be a little bit extra need. You're putting in kitchens, you're putting in bathrooms. It's a little bit beyond the scope of just bringing it up to modern standards. You're going to have to spend some dollars on top of that. And I think we were conservative, meaning we didn't really push those costs. I think this is fairly lean. Some soft costs, meaning design, architecture, whatever it may be to kind of get you there. And basically what it boils down to here is we looked at that budget of being in the order of magnitude of about $8 million. If we then, kind of take those costs, compare them to our revenue that's being produced, and come up with a value of what our finished product would be, which is the lower box here. This is using the income approach, which is just kind of standard method of valuation. Our market value of the building would be just under $4 million. Here it's 3.7. Everything's order of magnitude, but cost of about 8.1. Value on the market of about 3.7, meaning if that building was complete and finished and operating and people were paying rent, and you went to a broker and said, I want to sell this building, we think that's about $3.7 million worth of value. So the disconnect being you have an $8 million cost and a $3.7 million value. Therefore, our sort of feasibility test is challenged. And this is, again, the perspective of someone coming in and saying, I really want to redevelop that building. Again, more detail than probably anybody wants to deal with. But if you're going to finance this in a kind of traditional manner, I thought it'd be helpful. We thought it would be helpful to say, if we had that level of value and we had an $8 million budget, how could we finance this? So we sort of calculated what market debt. This would be the debt if you went to the bank and said, I need to borrow for a construction loan based on this building and this project. Equity, meaning that investor equity who's expecting some sort of return on their investment that's got a market rate. How much equity could you put in and afford to put in given the cash flow stream coming off? And then it might be tough to see up here, it's grayed out, but we also factored in if there were state historic tax credits, which would be very possible to use here. It is a competitive process. It's not a sure thing. But wanted to understand, we think that's about $1 million based on this scenario. Same with the federal historic tax credits, and those two often work together. It's about 1.2. My point here in dragging you through all these numbers is we look at it, there's a funding gap in that feasibility of about $3 million, or here just under 40%. So a pretty substantial difference between that cost and value, or cost and ability to finance the work that's being described. And just to continue down this path, and I'll speed it up here, if we then swap out the idea of apartments above, and I do know that at points, going further back in the past, some folks did not want to see residential in the building, but we thought it would be worthwhile to show in this sort of feasibility test. If we change that up and look at it being more of a multi-tenant professional building, something that is almost co-working in nature, where there's some small committed offices, there might be some sort of hot desk, but something that's definitely in demand and doing well in the market, and we could get our hands on the kind of economics of it. A similar story. Here we think it's probably a little bit less cost. You're not putting in kitchens and baths, but you're in the $8 million range from a cost perspective. and your gap in this case is probably a little bit more pronounced, about 47%. So somewhere between 40 and 50% of your capital stack is to be determined. Again, this is the viewpoint of, if you told me tomorrow I could have this building for $1, which sounds like a great deal, could I, as a development company, come in here and make it work right away? And I think from our back in the envelope sort of modeling and the information that we're building upon and all this detailed study that's been done in the past, I think the answer is it would be challenging unless there are some other things to help make this feasible. And this may be, and I know there's lots of different circumstances, but as we look through in the first slide of the context of going out to market a few times, there's been some folks that have responded, there's been enthusiasm, it's certainly a great spot, there's a lot of demand, but I think there's been a pattern, especially with the folks that we spoke to directly, of it was great, we're very excited about it, we had an architect look at it. Once we started to understand the cost to get there, we couldn't really continue because, we're a restaurateur, we couldn't spend $7 or $8 million and make that work for our business, and therefore we backed out. So that's the perspective we were trying to bring to this, is what that looks like. And again, we ran through many different scenarios with this kind of high-level modeling look. Happy to answer questions or talk about others. I know in the 2019 study, the detailed analysis was around a restaurant with event space above. It made some assumptions, which really it was one operator coming in, paying an above-market rent. From a financing perspective, I think we settled down to similar economics, but also have that hurdle of you would need that user to sign a kind of a long-term financeable lease. They would have to pay above market to operate. You fall into a similar pattern where this funding gap is still very prevalent and still very real. So general conclusions. That key factor is the notion that as soon as you're really touching that building in a significant way and making improvements in it, you're kicking off all of the upgrades necessary. It's a relatively small building that simply was built for a different era and a different use. And so you're suddenly hitting that cost burden. The scale, if this was a 300,000 square foot old mill or something like that, you could kind of make up some of that in scale, but in this case, it's 10,000 plus square feet. The costs, unfortunately, have continued to rise since previous studies. Interest rates have also risen, which challenges a little bit further. And really, from this perspective, anybody coming in to rehab, redo, develop, put this building back into a really active use is going to need some level of help or assistance. It might be private, might be public, might be both, might be a whole bunch of different things, but that there's going to be, most likely, for anybody coming along, that challenge. To go out to the street or go out to an RFP again, or to tweak it, may be successful, but based on the numbers being the numbers and the order of magnitude, it most likely would be that someone would come back with a similar conclusion that would say, what else can you do to help me do this? Or, I'd love to do it, but I really need help in some manner, or I need time to find help in some manner to start to fill that financial feasibility gap. And then, so I don't just be super negative and then walk away. There's several ways to kind of look at this, and some of these are very obvious. And I don't mean to state the obvious, but there are certain things that other similar scenarios and similar case studies have looked at and implemented. One is reducing the cost burden. Anything that starts to chip away at that big first step, as I described it, meaning if there are, I know there's never surplus funds or excess money doesn't exist, but direct investments to start to pick away at some of these code improvements. Probably more targeted would be to help define what that source might look like and then couple it up with a potential user that's coming in. There are some, as you know, you've applied to the MassDev underutilized properties. There are those funding sources that are out there, and often it's more compelling if there's sort of we're going to leverage private dollars, we've got an active user, Here's what we're trying to do, and we need you to gap fund it. So that kind of coupling to reduce that overall cost burden. Low or nominal, zero acquisition or lease payment, a flexible lease payments. I know there's been previous discussions when we first started about, what is the acquisition value? Is it $2 million? Is it 1.5? I think any acquisition gets layered on top of that for someone coming in, and it further increases that gap. And I know that's an uncomfortable thing to say and to hear. Other ways to think about it, maybe more creatively, is to start to look at, are there ways to subsidize the cash flow or the operating expenses? In some communities, in some states, municipalities, et cetera, there are master leases or guarantee programs or some sort of annual budget commitment that starts to either add revenue to the top line and makes the building worth more and helps reduce the gap, or reduces operating expenses and helps also kind of reduce that gap because you're increasing the net revenue. Real estate property tax abatement or TIF, offsetting snow removal, landscaping. I think there's some opportunities for that, the way the building sits and the parking sits. And then on the financial side, some of those financial tools in some places, usually potentially larger municipalities or cities, there might be low interest or no recourse loans that let people start to chip away at that gap. And then I think the potential to work directly with a potential operator. So getting somebody who's interested, or a user like one of the successful co-working places in the area, to say, if we were to partner with you and start to look at how to collectively look at this gap, that certainly has worked in other places as well. That is it. So I apologize for being the bearer of somewhat bad news, but again, it was asked to bring that perspective of someone who would pick this up and potentially redevelop it. So I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, well, it was, and thank you. And it isn't surprising. It is disappointing. It isn't surprising, given what we already knew from all the good work that had been done in the past. We were hoping that by bringing someone like yourself in and coming to us with a kind of a market point of view on, how we might go to market, whether it's to a developer or an operator, that we might see something in that we hadn't seen before. I think you did a good job of building on the work that the group from 2019 did. They spent a really long period of time, as you noted, putting together an exhaustive review of the building and concluded many of the things that you have concluded. The numbers, of course, have gone up, as you noted. I'm glad that you were able to leverage the work that they did. We specifically asked you not to redo the work because we felt the work had already been done. What we asked you to do is bring that different lens to it, which is that developer lens or operator lens, which you did do. I like the way you came at the model abstracts, because it makes it real for someone like me to say, 9 apartments above, restaurant below, or just a straight office building. What does it look like? What are the revenues? What are the expenses? What are the financing implications? All the things that you did. And I think you have already said this, but I want to just make sure that I heard it properly. When I went through the abstracts, I really came away with, on the first one in particular, because you gave us a lot more detail on the first abstract than the second one, but it was easy to connect the thinking into the second one. But the first question that I had was, if we did the investment that you have under abstract 1, which is the $8.2 million, and of course in that $8.2 million is the assumption of a couple of tax credits, which may or may not be doable, available, gettable, whatever the right word is. For an investment of $8.2 million, including the tax credits, you get a building worth $3.8 million. I think I heard you say that.
That's correct.
And that's what my own math showed, and I think that's right. So that's one thing that sort of I see as an impediment here, is to getting anybody to get involved with the building, because who would do that? It's the obvious question. The second one was, even if the town, because now we ask ourselves, okay, you have in the in the conclusions part of the document, and in your thinking about what are the alternatives that we might explore as a town. So let's say that we assume, first of all, that the financing could be gotten. That's a big question all by itself. Could you even get the financing? But let's assume it for argument that it could be gotten, and the equity number you've got is good, and the two tax credits are good, which leaves the gap of $3.2 million. If the town were to fill that gap for $3.2 million and do kind of a co-investment thing, that would still lead the investor into a $5 million investment for $3.8 million outcome, even if we covered the whole gap. And again, that assumes you can get the tax credits. So I'm thinking about that correctly. Would that be true?
It is. I mean, in some way, well, in a lot of ways, the tax credits are a subsidy program.
Yep.
So, with small caveats, they're really, they're not free money, but they're not dollars that need to get paid back. The federal, once you bring an investor, those things. But those can almost be seen as gap fillers themselves, or they are gap fillers and subsidies themselves. So if I were developing this and it was going to be worth that, and the town brought forth the funding gap, I could probably get comfortable with investing the $3 million of equity in the debt, knowing I'm going to amortize the debt, and if I can achieve everything that as it's shown here, I think it gets right to that feasibility check.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly a lot of other things to unpack here. This is very conceptual.
Yeah.
But I think that scenario would be compelling to a lot of folks.
Okay, so that's good to know. And in the abstract too, it's really the same thought process. It's a different model because of the way you came at it in terms of the equity valuation, the income valuation. You came more from a revenue valuation, but I applied the same thinking to it. The numbers come out relatively similar to abstract one, and so the same commentary would apply to both of these abstracts, correct?
It would. In general terms, the changes between the residential model and the more office, I believe that the commercial office would be a less expensive build-out because you're not building all the kitchens and baths. Economize a little bit, and the rents would be a little bit lower. So you've got those two offsetting pieces, and I think the conclusion is very similar. The gap is a little higher. At this level, they're roughly in the same ballpark.
And then the final thing that, when I look at the conclusions and some of your, how do you think about creative ways to solve the problem? You mentioned, operating expenses. We currently spend about $34,000 a year operating the building, just keeping the lights on. We're not really using it, not in any material sense, but we pay $34,000 a year. That's what we have in the budget to run the building, keep it heated, lighted, and all that kind of stuff. If we were to think about applying what we already have in our run rate budget of $34,000 into this equation and continue that in an ongoing fashion, and if we were able to do something, you didn't mention any kind of a tax incentive in any of the work that you've done beyond the credits. You talked about the credits, but I'm talking about more of a direct tax incentive in a public-private partnership. And I'm guessing a little bit about what those taxes might be, but it seems to me as though the cost of the town would be pretty high. It'd be probably $1 million over 25 years is the way I think it would play out if we were to subsidize operating expenses. So the question that I had for you was, if that was something we were to go look at, and given the other aspects that are in your analysis, how big do the operating expenses play into a decision to invest or not? Because they're clearly the smaller part of the equation.
Yes, they do factor in, and I'm trying to think if I can illustrate on that side. In looking at the value of a finished building, it's called the income approach. It's really the net operating income that's important. That's the number that banks lend against. That's what dictates, once you pay your debt service, what investors get back. that net operating income number is really the key. If you go get an appraisal on an operating commercial building, they look at that net operating income as the platform to decide, here's what it's worth. That includes the operating expenses. So it's the rents that come in, and then those necessary expenses that have to pay to operate the common utilities, the real estate taxes, insurance, snow plowing, whatever it may be. What falls out below that is that net operating number. That really is the key to valuation. As a real estate developer and advisor, that net operating number is the one that matters.
In an abstract one, it was what, 43,000?
Your memory's better than mine.
I think it was, yeah.
Right. Yeah, the net operating there is 67.
67,000, okay, I had it wrong.
And then, again, this is a fairly high-level analysis. This is me applying a per unit and per square foot
Yep.
look based on market comparables. I went light on it, assuming that taxes would be relatively low, that there'd be something to help, but honestly, not a very detailed analysis on what those expenses would be. But I think if you look at this, you know, the gross income is basically the summation of all the rents coming in. You're losing some vacancy in collection. You know, there's always turnover or late payment, et cetera. And then you have your operating expenses. So that net operating income is the one that then we apply a market factor to a capitalization rate to come up with that market value of 3.7. That's what determines how much money we can borrow, et cetera. So to your larger question, and I hope I'm answering it correctly, real estate taxes is something the municipality can control and say, let's keep taxes extremely low, even though it's a private development project, or if it is a lease, you know, there's mechanisms to allow you to keep those taxes low. That helps these economics, because by having less operating expenses, the net operating income is that much higher, the valuation is that much higher, they can borrow more, they can invest more, et cetera. So if there were also an offset of taking the dollars that you're now spending, $34,000 per year, and saying that you're going to pledge that as part of the budget into the project, between the taxes and that, it would certainly help improve this. I don't believe the math. The math would not bring it down to a funding gap of 0, but you may see 800,000 or so in increase. And I'd like to check that math, but
Yeah, I mean, I came up with $1 million when
Okay, yeah.
when I did it, so I think
Yep.
we're in the same kind of ballpark. So that's an interesting thought as well. The building provides us no tax at all, no property tax at all right now. So in some ways, and this is the way I keep thinking about it, how do we take the cost burden off the town? So that's the $34,000 in the run rate that we have to operate the building but not use it. It would go up if we actually tried to use it. So that's just to keep the building from not, you know, deteriorating. And then from a capital point of view, since 2014, the math that we've been doing on this, and you had 200 some odd thousand, I think the number is really 628,000 based on further work we've done, including about 100,000 that's been spent out of the ARPA money that we got through COVID recently. We still have another 200,000 that's parked to the side to apply against the building that this board voted to do. So that number could go well north of the 628 that we've already spent. Since 2000, we spent over $1 million on this building, capital-wise. So it's a bit of a cost sink, and yet it's a building that has enormous historic value to the town. It's a building that we'd like to retain and restore. There's a lot of reasons why we would want to do what we want to do. The challenge is, how do we bring something forth that gets us to eliminate the cost sink side of it, or at least to the extent that we can, and bring something of value into the community where we can actually use the building in an economically sound way. And it just feels really hard, you know, based on everything that has been done and all the studies that we've done, the work you've now done has just reinforced it. It just seems really, really hard. So I'm going to open it up to the rest of the board for questions and comments at this point. Who'd like to go first?
Sure.
Ben?
I just had a quick question. I think actually Jim or maybe Patrick could answer this. When we're talking about, one of the items that was mentioned here and that Eric, I think you mentioned, was so grant applications and other outside funding sources, things that might come from the state or the government. So we had applied and not received the one-stop grant. What was that? Was like $250,000, right?
Yeah.
That we applied for, right, in the neighborhood? Right, okay. So considering that, you know, we've looked at those, we weren't able to get that one, of course, there's others, and we could spend time and resources in pursuing those. I mean, that's not even in the ballpark of the numbers that we're talking about here, right? I mean, not even close. So I wanted to touch on that, but I would just echo what Jim O'Neill just said in terms of, I appreciate, you know, putting together these 2 or 3 scenarios, because it really gives us a stark look at the numbers, and I think gives everyone in residence, people who are interested, the idea of, yeah, these are the numbers we're talking about, this is the ballpark. So I think we have, you know, some more to chew on, some more to think about. So, thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, thanks, Eric, for doing this. It's a lot to unpack here, and I think clearly the challenges are apparent. I'm just curious on your model abstracts. I know we talked a little bit, or you talked a little bit, and about restaurants and sort of functions as being a possible use. And my conversations with people in the industry, they've expressed interest in that property as not the way it is today, but what it could potentially be. You know, minus the price tag, of course. But I'm just curious, if I'm looking at your model abstracts, if I look, and you didn't give me a comprehensive view, and that's fine, but is the multi-tenant professional office, you know, scenario the closest to that use? That
Probably,
Okay.
yes.
as far as price tags and sort of what's triple net leases and things like that?
I think so. To be honest, we started down the path of looking at a model like that. And we could pull one together. We did talk with several event operators, and
Good, yeah.
I think, to echo what you said, we heard universal, we love it.
Yeah,
We absolutely love it.
Of course.
And then we kind of got to the cost perspective.
Right.
And again, to be honest, when I first walked the building with one of my colleagues and we were taking a look at it, that jumps out at you, you know,
Yeah,
the upper
it does.
floors. But I think on that one, my comment that I poorly made here, because I was passing through it quickly, was if you look at that, it is truly an operator. Someone's putting all their eggs in that basket of that operator. It's not a real estate development per se, as much as you're underwriting an event business.
Yeah.
So a good operator with a longer-term lease that could be financeable in the manner that we've talked about here,
Yeah.
I think starts to open things up. The rents shown in the 2019 study, again, I'm not challenging or poking holes, are sort of above market, and so it might assume that there's a higher level of fit-out as well. So the cost and the revenue might kind of reshuffle, and I'm happy to look at it further and break it down at this conceptual level if it's helpful.
Okay, yeah, no, it's just something that I'm interested as a possible use, and like you said, so are other people. But the math would have to work, and we'd have to sort of give the incentives that, you know, that made it work, I think, from the town's perspective. So, thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add, I just wanted to add one thing that I had thought about when you were giving your presentation, and Glenn just kind of brought me back to it, but that operator event space, that's what allows the residents and everyone in the town still to use it probably the most, right? Because if you make it residential, I know people weren't fans of that. One of the reasons is because nobody will ever see it. So I think understanding, you know, that you've put some scenarios here, I don't know that we need to go any further down that road at this point, but just to echo what Glenn said, that's really what we're interested in, I think, right? Is because then that's what opens it up to the public. The town itself could conceivably have functions there as well. So,
Yeah.
again, just reiterating that point.
Yeah, this is a lot of great information, thank you. I think I've walked through that building in the last year, and when you walk through it, it's like an amazing building where you can visualize a lot of potential, but the numbers are very hard to overcome. And financially, it's going to be difficult. But I think this gives us a really new conversation to have, and what like the next plans of action could be. So thank you.
So Eric, thanks for doing the work and taking us through it. As Ben said, it's more things for us to now think about. It does seem as though it's a daunting task to come up with a path forward on this one. So more to come on it, but again, thank you for the work you've done on it.
Great, and thank you all. Appreciate it. And
Great.
Please let me know as questions come up. We've got models and the experience, so happy to respond to anything and run different scenarios. And certainly in other places, in other communities, similar buildings have been redeveloped. It's just a challenge in these
Yeah.
lots of homes.
Great, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have a request from the Walpole Chamber and Azure Lodge of Walpole to use the Stone Street Municipal Lot on Sunday, April 23rd for an auto show. And I think we have Harry here to talk us through that. So Harry, welcome.
Thank you for your time.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you have the handout that I had supplied to our last meeting with some of the department heads. But yes, we're hoping to host our first annual Walpole Car Show here at the municipal parking lot next to Stone Field. It will be hosted by the Walpole Chamber of Commerce and the Azure Lodge of Freemasons, both 501(c)(3)s. For the first year, we're hoping to, well, for time, it's going to be on a Sunday morning, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. We're hoping for a rain date as well as for April 30th. We're hoping to have about, it's a big guess, but I'm saying 80 to 100 cars. Most of those cars would be pre-1974. Available parking spaces in the parking lot are 130. We're hoping not to use all of those, especially leave the ones that the fire station needs for their employees alone. Visitors will be able to park along Stone Street Field parking, here at Town Hall, Blackstone, and along Main Street, and walk right to the event. We're hoping to see approximately 500 to 800 people throughout the day. Again, that's a big guess. It could turn into a lot more, especially if it's a great day. We should have plenty of volunteers from the Walpole Chamber and the Walpole Freemasons. I've also spoken to Jalapenos and Cosmos. Jalapenos would probably utilize the tent that they'll have available by the spring that they used last year. They would probably start around 11 o'clock. They're more of a lunch offering. Recently, Cosmos started doing brunch, so they're going to probably be able to do their brunch, and they've got their back spot too, which is going to be perfect location for all the people and spectators. We may or may not offer some other food services. The Walpole Lions Group suggested they may want to help us out if we need it. Hot dogs and what do they do? The Anna's Fried Dough, I'm not sure exactly. But if we do bring them on board, they'll have to go through the Board of Health, of course. We're probably going to have a tent or two, just, for the Masons, we'll have a tent. The Chamber will have a tent. We'll probably have coffee and donuts in the morning for some people. And when it comes to the infrastructure standpoint, there are dumpsters on site that could be utilized. The Chamber actually has access to that dumpster, but we're also going to probably be putting multiple trash bins throughout the area as well. As I mentioned, there'll be booths for information, coffee, water. We might have, when I say music, it might just be somebody with a speaker system playing some music. And then addressing the restrooms, the Walpole Chamber office is right there next to Cosmos, so we can go right up and use male and female bathrooms that are up there. Cosmos has bathrooms, Jalapenos has bathrooms, and potentially Blackburn Hall was discussed as a additional venue for bathroom services. That's really the gist of it.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I like it. Have we run it by the fire chief and the police chief? And do they
Yes.
have any concerns?
No, they've been involved.
Good,
yeah,
okay.
Harry's been great about working with them, so.
I like the idea a lot. I note that you mentioned Blackburn Hall here as a possible use for additional restrooms. So that's certainly something we should go and take a look at, opening Blackburn up, and hopefully that would help you out.
That'd be great.
Yeah, and certainly would support that. So any questions or comments from the board?
Sounds good.
Ally?
Yep, sounds good. Very good. Motion to approve request of Walpole Chamber and Azure Lodge of Walpole to use Stone Street Municipal Lot on Sunday, April 23rd, from 9 to 2 with a car and auto show with a rain date of April 30th, 2023.
Second?
A motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
400. Good luck, Harry.
Thank you very much, appreciate it,
Thanks for
hope to see you there.
coming. Okay. All right, next up, we've got the fire chief, Chief Bailey, to talk about ambulance rates and perhaps some changes we're making there. Good evening, chief.
Good evening, and thank you. So the last time, tonight I am before you to discuss ambulance rates. I sent a memo to you with my suggested changes to that. The last time that we changed the rates was in 2020, and prior to that, it was in 2017. So approximately every 3 years, we're before you asking for an increase in the rates. The sheet that I sent you has the different rates that we use, which is BLS emergency rate, ALS 1, ALS 2, specialty care, which we really don't use. That's more of a transfer rate, but it's on our schedule, so we leave it on there and we adjust it accordingly, but it's really not something that we use, so. But not to say that we couldn't in an emergency situation. If it ever arose, we have the fee structure in place to do it. Then the mileage and extra EMT, which is what we utilize for any serious trauma or cardiac arrest or any other call that requires extra people in the back to administer care. It's just a fee to cover the cost of that individual that's in the back. So what I've proposed, the current rates are listed on the bottom on the left of where we currently are. The proposal is off of the billing company that we have, which is Comstar. They have an average of the top 50 companies that they use. And after analyzing the rates that I sent you of the survey that we utilized, which was 20 communities within Norfolk County that have fire-based EMS. We're not at the high, we're not at the low. And when I looked at that, that was something that I did take into consideration. Our rates, even with the proposed difference, does not make us the highest. It makes us, we are in that top tier, but we had fallen behind everyone else because of the way the rates are adjusted, and not everyone does them every 3 years as we have been doing. So that is where I came up with the rate, and that is what I'm proposing for you. The difference between the current and the proposed is on the right-hand column. Two of them are impacted quite significantly, the 142 and the 131, with the 90 being the lower. That's for the ALS 1. The difference between ALS 1 and ALS 2 is the amount of interventions. ALS 1 is ALS call, advanced life services, but it only has one intervention. ALS 2 is anything with 3 or more interventions, so cardiac arrest, severe trauma, STEMIs, anything like that that requires more is what that ALS 2 is. And with that, I'll entertain any questions that you may have.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for doing the work to pull this analysis together and bring forth a recommendation. Really appreciate that, Chief. And you did go through all of the surrounding towns. I note on the back here, I think there are 19 of them in total. So it was nice to be able to do comparisons to the other towns. And to your point, we're not at the top, we're not at the bottom, we're somewhere in the middle on all of these. So I'm prepared to support your recommendation, Chief. Let me see if any members of the board want to comment. Anybody?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. Thanks. I also agree that it makes a lot of sense what you did, your formula. I've asked you this question before. I'm going to ask it again because I forget. I remember you told me that basic life support, you very rarely are operating an ambulance on basic life support. You're almost always in the ALS category.
No, actually, I did a 3-year analysis this afternoon of our last 3 years. Starting in 2020, we had 1,033 ALS, 1,016 BLS.
So
In 21, we had 1,188 ALS, 1,195 BLS, almost a 50-50 split.
they're about the same. Okay, and the ALS is split between 1 and 2?
Yes, it is.
Understood.
And in 22, we had 1,078 ALS, 1,154 on the BLS.
Okay.
So a little bit more on the BLS side that particular year.
Got it. That's not what I remember. But,
So
thanks
one
for
of the things that's impacted that and driven the BLS number up a little bit is the mental health calls that we have are not most of those are not ALS interventions. Those are BLS interventions. Those numbers are way up for us. And then hence the increase in the BLS side.
Okay, yeah, good to know. All right, thanks, I'm all set, yeah.
Ally?
No, I'm good.
Good, okay. Ally?
Motion to approve the new ambulance rates as recommended by Chief Bailey.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
400. Chief, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we have a discussion on additional 2% retiree cost of living adjustment for FY '23. Jim, do you want to?
Sure, and Lisa's going to help me out with this,
Okay,
too.
great,
So,
okay. Hi, Lisa.
Lisa, as you know, sits on the retirement board for Norfolk County. She's our representative there. This request recently came through, and it's not my understanding that it only impacts a small portion of the retirees' initial $18,000, right? The first
Yes, their first
$18,000?
$18,000 of
And,
retirement.
they're basically polling the towns to see if they'd be willing. It's an option that Governor Baker signed in
November.
back in November. And if a majority of the towns go for it, it happens.
Yes.
So they're asking the select board to consider it. Anything else to add, Lisa? Did I
No,
miss
it was a
anything?
change in process. You've never had to be involved in this before, but because it's the additional 2% and it's a one-time thing, they've asked all the different towns in the county. It was a process, and you're the next step in the process. If you approve it, and we need 2/3 of the towns in the county, it's like 19 towns, to approve it, and then they get the 2%. Just on the first 18, and it's only anybody retired before July 1st of 2021.
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly straightforward in the write-up here, and both you and Jim have clarified any questions that I would have had, so I'm good with it. Any other questions or comments from the board? Okay, Ally?
Motion to increase the COLA an additional 2% for FY '23 only.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
400. Thank you,
Thank you.
Lisa. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lisa.
Next, we have MWRA project funding assistance. Jim, do you want to
So
take us through that
Lisa
one?
and Rick, I've asked them to come in and kind of give a brief overview of this one. Should I ask you to stay up there, Lisa? Sorry.
Well, it's basically, we're asking you to vote and approve the bonds for $79,012.50 that they're borrowing for Phase 14 of the MWRA infiltration and flow assistance.
And that was approved by town meeting
Yeah.
just recently.
Yeah.
And have the bonds actually been bid, or is that subsequent to our
That-
vote?
It's through the MWRA.
Oh,
It's
I
their
gotcha.
bonds
It's
that
their
we're
bonds.
signing, so you
I
just have
gotcha.
to.
Okay, all right, great. Any questions for Lisa?
How many more of these phases do we have, Rick, do you know? Are there-
14 is the last one that they have appropriated so far.
There may come more in the future, but.
I'm
yeah.
sure there'll be more to follow.
Okay.
But they haven't released it yet.
Okay.
Okay,
I move the forms of votes presented to this meeting to be adopted as written and incorporated into the minutes of this meeting in full.
Second.
all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
400. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate it. Thanks, Rick. Appreciate it. Okay, it's after 8 o'clock. Open forum. Anyone here to speak at open forum? Bill?
Yes, I had the pleasure of doing a lot of work with Frank Farinacci, and he told me that the best way to get water from the MWRA is to have them put it into our 2 tanks in South Walpole. That would not cause any infrastructure changes. We would not have to pump water up from the Norwood line. We wouldn't have to change how water is distributed amongst the tanks as it is now. It would all stay the same. And when I was campaigning last year, I met a lot of people who had done a lot of talk about the warehouse that was going to be a distributor and at the hospital site. And they were going to get water from Route 1, from the MWRA, because it's already up as far as our tanks. That water could be brought across, they were thinking about bringing it across Kraft property, hitting a main street, going to the hospital, and then offering it to the state, which would get state help from the state representatives. And then later on, when this big prison complex got sewer, they would offer sewer to the hospital complex for the new building, and those people in the new building who were friendly with Kraft would then offer their sewer to Kraft. Now, that was a plan that went on, but that hospital fell through. So I think that we ought to consider, if we're gonna, I'm not in favor of buying water from the MWRA, but if we're considering doing it, I think we ought to look into getting the water from the stadium hookup there on Route 1 over to our 2 towers. That would make it a lot cheaper. But there's also an idea that went back with the 3-member Water and Sewer Commission, which was Frank Farinacci, Ron Fusil, and Ted Delaney. They were working with, and I got to work with them, I was on the Conservation Commission. They were working with Franklin and Bellingham to develop a reservoir. They had a beautiful site for a reservoir. What happened was 2 computer companies, Digital, which is DEC, and Prime, put 2 companies there, bought the property, and the reservoir was not done. So we lost that reservoir. I think we should revisit that. Now, both Digital and Prime are now owned by major computer companies, and they may not have as much interest in that site that was a wonderful natural site for for a reservoir. Now, the other thing that would, I think, make sense is the MWRA found 5 depressions in Walpole that they considered attractive for dumping sludge. Well, those 5 depressions could be reservoirs. And the one I'm most interested in is the one the MWRA owns in the prison complex, which is over 90 acres. It's well protected by the prison complex. Anyone that goes in there is immediately known as being a trespasser, because it's all prison property, and the correction department is very careful about who is on their site. And that could be a reservoir. So I would hope that we would talk to the MWRA about either purchasing that land from them and then turning it into a reservoir, or having the MWRA turn it into a reservoir. The MWRA has not added any new reservoirs for over 40 years. And way back when I was interested, when we did the IEP study for our Water Resource Protection Overlay District, I learned then that 80% of the population of Massachusetts drinks water from the Quabbin and the other 2 reservoirs. So we have a lot of demand on that now. And Frank Farinacci told me that getting water from the Quabbin would use that big tunneling facility that goes to Quincy. We would be drawing from that. And in order for us to draw from that, we would cross 2 earthquake fault lines, which would be not a good opportunity. It would be a terrible opportunity if we had a fault and the lines were disrupted and those big water transporters failed, and it would affect Quincy and it would affect us. So I would hope that we would, before we spent money, I was at the sewer and water meeting, they're talking about maybe $1 million or millions of dollars in developing a pumping station at the Norwood line to pump that all the way up. Bringing water from the Norwood line into our system, as Frank Farinacci told me years ago, and he was the engineer for our water system, that would cause a tremendous amount of infrastructure changes to our water tank system, which we need. So I would hope that we would do that we would investigate the possibility for a reservoir at the prison system and up in Franklin and Bellingham, which would be gravity feed down and would be a lot less expensive than buying water from the MWRA. And the other possibility is if we had to, on an emergency basis, get water, that we would get it from that complex on at the stadium to bring water over to our 2 tanks, and we could feed water from the MWRA, and they require a positive air gap. You can't just attach a pump and have them pump water into our system. There would have to be a positive air gap, and the tanks could provide that. So I'm hoping that you'll think about that, thinking out of the box.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
Anybody else here to speak at open forum? Okay, being none, we'll move on. So on to new business. We have the Springtown meeting warrant vote. Jim, anything that you want to bring up
No,
there?
just to note that we have 32 articles on here. Finance Committee has already started covering the articles and voting on them. I believe last night they took votes on about five articles. So at my request, it was going to be on one of my budget updates, would be that the board start to take up the articles. This is the most articles we've had kind of in the last few town meetings. So if we pick away at them after town, the Finance Committee does, I think, would make some headway.
Good. Yeah,
If you're
makes
okay
sense.
with that.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Questions for Jim? Ben?
There's what, 8 zoning bylaw changes?
9.
9 zoning bylaw
Yeah.
changes, a lot of tables. So these are as kind of, I'm not sure what the proper word is, not approved, but as edited by the planning board?
They're set to hold their hearing. They've advertised it now, I believe, and they're set to hold their public hearing on March 16th.
Okay,
So 8 of them are sponsored by the planning board and
one of them
one
by
the
us.
board.
Right. But so the language there, though, like who, the planning board's reviewed that language already, right? I mean, they haven't had a public hearing and everything, they haven't voted on it formally, but they've been,
Patrick's presented it
Yeah.
to them, and they were willing to
Yeah.
sponsor.
okay. All right, cool, thanks.
Glenn, Ally?
I'm okay.
Okay, Ally?
Motion to sign the spring 2023 town meeting warrant.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
400. Ally, let's just go to number 2 and number 3.
Motion to approve request of Frank Musher for a one-day all-alcoholic beverage license at 137 Stone Street on March 18th, 2023, from 2 to 6 p.m., and March 24th, 2023, from 6:30 to 9:30 p.m.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
400.
Motion to approve request of Daniel Sergi to a one-day alcoholic beverage license at 40 Brook Street on April 29th, 2023, from 12 to 8 p.m.
Seconded.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
400. Consent agenda.
Motion to accept with gratitude the following donations. Various donors the night before the fourth gift account in the amount of 118. Various donors the night before the fourth gift account in the amount of 171. And Tony and Barbara LaRusso in memory of Madeline Taylor to COA Gifts in the amount of $250.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
400. And the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes of February 7th, 2023 as presented in our packet.
A second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And I'll abstain, so 301. I wasn't present. Town administrators update, Jim?
Sure. Briefly, just Finance Committee, they're making their way through everything to do with town meeting. We have considered all of the budgets on the town side and the school side. They've expressed general support for what's being presented. I believe they're set to consider the budget and take a vote on it end of March, beginning of April. The governor just released her state aid figures for local governments. And to our surprise, Walpole's set to receive a considerable amount of money. But I'm a bit concerned that we've never seen this amount of drastic increase in local aid in 1 year since in my 19 years here in Walpole. So I'm really pessimistic as to whether or not that'll go through. So I've already reached out to a few of our state reps to see what their general thoughts are on it. And some of our contacts have asked Jody to reach out to some of her other finance directors and town accountants to see what they're hearing. It's a big increase, and that'd be great if it went through, but I just don't want to change the budget around and then have it fall through and have to adjust the budget again. So
What's a big increase?
almost 1.5 million.
Okay.
It's a big difference
Yeah.
over what we had budgeted. So
Okay.
usually it's a difference of 100, 200,000. So more to come on that one. Water and sewer budgets, they are finalized. The commissioners reviewed the budgets and expressed support last night for what's been drafted. Finance committee is set to review the sewer and water budgets Thursday night, and I already mentioned where we're at with the warrant, so we're good to go. That's it.
Good. Any questions for Jim? Okay, well, that concludes our agenda for this evening. We are going to go into executive session, and I'll go through that in a minute. I don't intend for us to come back into public session after the executive session. We'll just adjourn from there. So, under the rules, I hereby declare it is the board's intention to go into executive session for purpose 3, which is to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation if open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining or litigating position of the public body and the chair so declares. As discussion of the foregoing in open session could compromise the purpose of the executive session, with the select board not returning to open session at the conclusion of the executive session. And I'll just keep going. So the motion, I'll move that the select board enter into executive session for purposes stated by the chair, with the board not returning to open session at the conclusion of the executive session. This has to be a roll call vote, so do I have a second?
Second,
And Ally?
yes?
Glenn?
Yes.
Ben?
Yes.
And Jim, yes. So we are now in executive session, and Patrick, you can take us off the air. Thank you, everybody.
I'm gonna use the restroom.